Hello, and welcome to Teacher Diversity and Student Success, Why Racial Representation Matters in the Classroom. This presentation is brought to you by the Brown Center for Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. I'm Andre Perry, Senior Fellow at Brookings, and I'll be serving as your moderator for the event. You know, teacher diversity is an issue that is both personal and a professional interest of mine. Prior to coming to Brookings, I was a charter school leader in New Orleans after Katrina. Approximately 10 years after the levees were breached, the share of black teachers in New Orleans dropped from over 70% to about 50%. Replaced by a younger, mostly white teaching corps, 2/3 of the teachers who had worked in New Orleans before Katrina were no longer in the field. The erasure of Black teachers flew in the face of research showing the positive effects of Black educators on academic success in particular. Many of the positive effects are highlighted in the new offering by Harvard Education Press, Teacher Diversity and Student Success, Why Racial Representation Matters in the Classroom by Seth Gershenson, Michael Hansen, and Constance A. Lindsay. Today, we will see a presentation of the book by its authors, as well as a panel on the topic. I will be joined later on by Patricia Alvarez-McHatton. Dr. Alvarez-McHatton is a Senior Vice President of Branch Ed, an organization dedicated to strengthening, growing, and amplifying the impact of educator preparation at minority-serving institutions across the country. Seth Gershenson is an associate professor of public policy at American University School of Public Affairs. He is also a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics and a senior technical advisor to Johns Hopkins University's Education Policy Institute. Constance A. Lindsay is an assistant professor of education at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill School of Education. Dr. Lindsay's research focuses on policies and practices to close racial achievement gaps in education, with a special focus on teachers. And Michael Hansen. Michael Hansen is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the director of the Brown Center on Education Policy. Dr. Hansen is a labor economist whose primary research focus is on the public teacher workforce. First, we will hear a presentation by the book's authors, and then we'll go into that panel discussion. We welcome those in the listening audience to participate in the conversation by using the hashtag #TeacherDiversity on social media. You can submit questions by tagging the Brown Center using the Twitter handle @Brookings Ed, or by sending an email to events@brookings.edu. So hashtag Teacher Diversity @Brookings Ed, or send an email to events@brookings.edu. We will be pulling from these questions today during our panel discussion. And by the way, and in the meantime, you can order their book and get a 20% discount by putting in the code TDSS21. That's T as in Tom, D as in David, S as in Sam, S as in Sam 21. And so right now I'm going to kick it off to our panelists. And I think it's going to be Seth who will take it from here.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone at Brookings for making this event happen today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Here is the code again, and you can order the book from Harvard Education Press. And I'm going to lead off our discussion of the book. Before I do that, though, I want to give two pieces of context that Andre alluded to in his opening remarks. And basically, these issues of achievement gaps and of a unrepresentative teaching force are not unique to New Orleans, but they're really persistent and prevalent across the United States. So in terms of the racial and ethnic achievement gaps, this data is showing 8th grade math score gaps between Black and white students and Latino and white students. And The point here is just that these gaps are large and have been fairly stable over the past 30 years, and they're still present today. And they're not unique to 8th grade, and they're not unique to math, and they're not even unique to test scores. These racial and ethnic achievement gaps are present in any educational outcome we look at any grade level, whether it's test scores or course grades or graduation rates or college enrollment rates. And this is really troubling because we know that at the individual level, education is hugely important. In some sense, it's a human right, but it also really facilitates the American dream and the idea of being able to better yourself and seize opportunity and make the most of your abilities and potential. But the other important thing to note is that education is also good for society at large. The benefits of education don't only accrue to the individual attaining that education, but society as a whole benefits from a higher educated workforce in terms of higher wages, in terms of increased productivity, and so on. And also less government spending on crime and health and social benefits and so on. So education is important for the individual and for society. And it's really troubling that we see these gaps because they suggest that not everyone is reaching their full potential and that not everyone is being given a fair and equal opportunity to reach that potential. We argue in the book that access to a high quality teacher force is key to a high quality education. And specifically, part of a high quality teaching force is a representative teaching force. And Andre mentioned the exodus of Black teachers from New Orleans schools after Katrina. A similar phenomenon happened after the Brown versus Board decision that we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. But right off the bat, I just want to show these national numbers from 2015. The bottom line is that the teaching force has been and remains about 80% white. However, the student body has changed dramatically over the past 100 and even over the past 40 or 50 years. And today, the student body is only about 50% white. And then the share of Black and Hispanic students has increased quite a bit. And so what we're left with today is a teaching force that quite simply is not representative of the students they serve. And that really matters. We know, and we argue in the book that diversity is a dimension of quality. And what we mean by that is that there is now a huge and robust literature that shows that same-race teachers and access and exposure to teachers who look like you increase and improve all sorts of educational outcomes, both immediately and in the long run. Especially for Black and Latino students, having a same-race teacher, even once, reduces absences and suspensions, improves test scores. It increases gifted and talented referrals. We know that teachers themselves have higher expectations for students. Students are more engaged in school. And all of that culminates and builds towards long-run beneficial outcomes. And if one statistic you take away from this literature, I think it's this. Having even one Black teacher in kindergarten significantly increases the chances that Black students not only graduate high school, but enroll in college. So why is that? Why does representation matter? Understanding why and thinking about why is really key to developing an appropriate policy response. And there's basically 3 reasons why representation matters, why we see these effects. And importantly, they're not mutually exclusive, and they're probably all happening at the same time in different ways. But the 3 basic ideas are, first, same-race teachers have greater cultural competence, are able to build more trusting and meaningful relationships with students, and they might teach using a so-called culturally relevant pedagogy. The second is, quite simply, they have high expectations and less bias. And they show these expectations and voice these expectations to students, which really matters. High expectations matter, and they affect student engagement, student expectations, and ultimately student outcomes. And then finally, they serve as role models. And this is maybe a nebulous term that can mean different things to different people, but the point is that students have an opportunity to see someone who looks like them in a position of authority, in a role that requires an education, in a professional role. And all three of these things have different implications for how we should act on this basic finding that same-race teachers and a representative teaching force matters. And we'll talk about this at length throughout the book and in this discussion when we get to the policy implications.
So, though we're sort of talking about this current open policy window, we thought it was really important in the book to really give the historical context and sort of put it all together in thinking about how past experiences of teachers of color and historically marginalized groups in this country have sort of led to these current realities. And so not so sort of thinking about expanding this beyond just Black teachers, thinking about Native American teachers, Asian and Latinx teachers. There's sort of different historical strands that lead to some of those representation gaps that Seth just described. Public schools in America have historically been used as a vehicle of assimilation into white American culture. So for example, we have the Native Americans and the example of the Indian boarding schools, right? So you have trying to socialize students by taking away their culture and integrating them into the larger society. And in many cases, that meant sort of the marginalization of teachers of color. Probably the example that people are most familiar with is Brown versus Board, which Seth alluded to. And basically this decision that led to the integration of schools led to a variety of ways in which Black teachers were either not integrated. There were tools that were developed to exclude them from classrooms. And so this has many generational impacts in terms of who teachers were and who they came to be, and sort of thinking about human capital and the ways in which the teacher profession grows over time. And so teacher diversity is dependent on non-white students' access to quality schooling and integration. But it's critical that as we sort of think about policy options and ways in which we can remedy some of these things, we acknowledge this very complex history around teachers of color, sort of slated against some of the other policy goals that we've identified to pursue in the past. And so when we're thinking about this, I like to think about this teacher diversity issue in terms of this broad sort of teacher/human capital pipeline, right? And so you can think about the way that a teacher ends up in the classroom, and you can think about the ways in which teachers of color sort of fall out of this pipeline at every step along the way. So at its heart, this question of teacher diversity is really a college access issue, right? And so to the extent that we don't have the numbers of college graduates of color, we have a very constrained pipeline. And so everything we can do to sort of think about that, those K-12 achievement differentials that lead into differences in students of color becoming BA holders, we have to expand sort of that first stop along the way. Students of color are less likely to major in education. They are schools of education in particular are less diverse than the student bodies and the universities in which they're housed. And of the education majors who enter teaching, they are also less likely to be the students of color who major in education. And then once teachers of color get in the classroom, there's all sorts of things that impact their careers that lead to teacher attrition, such as working at different types of schools that might have more challenging conditions. But once you account for all these things, differences in turnover are relatively small, but there's lots of differences in terms of where teachers of color work. And so we think it's important to consider all these leaks in the pipeline as we think about policy remedies, both in terms of diversifying, but also keeping the high quality, diverse workforce that we want to have.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Constance. I appreciate that. The final section of the book develops a policy roadmap to help various stakeholders in the public school system understand how to strategically address teacher diversity. Seth led our presentation off today with the argument that teacher diversity is teacher quality. Some may view this as a provocative statement, but I want to briefly describe why this provocative position is necessary. We see this mantra, teacher diversity is teacher quality, as being very useful in motivating policy actions in a few different ways. First, it's operationally useful in clarifying that diversity should be an integral element to providing students a quality education. We should not simply be promoting teacher diversity from the macro workforce perspective, but also from the more micro lens of the student's perspective to ensure that all students have access to a diversity of teachers as they matriculate in public schools. Second, it's strategically useful to unify different interest groups within the education reform and advocacy space around a common objective. There's a genuine policy interest on teacher diversity building in many states, and we believe this messaging can help ensure that we build durable coalitions to take advantage of this window, rather than squandering political capital and losing momentum. Third, using teacher race as a policy lever is legally justified when we see it as a critical component of teacher quality. To be clear, we do not mean for this mantra to give the impression that teachers' racial or ethnic background is what makes a quality teacher. Rather, we want states and districts to consider teachers' race as one of many useful and relevant predictors of quality alongside other metrics that are already being used. Things like teacher experience, qualifications, classroom observations, or value-added measures, for example. Now, there are ways that many states, districts, and school leaders can act to help promote teacher diversity and more inclusive schools. To try and wrap our hands around the problem, we classify these potential policy actions into three distinct categories. First, we want to develop a more robust pipeline for teachers of color into schools. Examples here could include loan forgiveness or scholarships, teacher residency and grow your own programs, or lowering the bottom rung of the career ladder to get paraprofessionals at the front of the classroom. The second category is what we refer to as engineering more opportunities for exposures to teachers of color. An interesting thing is that we can provide nearly universal student exposure to a diverse teacher workforce with the level of racial diversity that is already available in the teacher workforce, as underrepresented as it is, as long as we're doing so in a creative and strategic way as how we assign students to teachers. And finally, the third category is that we want to develop a cultural competency in white teachers. We can better utilize training opportunities like student teaching and pre-service for pre-service teachers, and provide better in-service professional development to help educators on how they can learn about their unconscious biases and how those biases may undermine their efficacy with students of color. And then, of course, how to correct those behaviors. A primary motivation for writing this book was that we saw some common pitfalls being implemented in states and districts that we believed were being counterproductive to teacher diversity based on the evidence. One of the main pitfalls that we saw was that diversity goals often dominated policy conversations, though in our view, workforce diversity is just one of these categories of potential policy action listed here. Another related pitfall was that we saw many states and districts set relatively aggressive goals for increasing diversity in a pretty short time window, while overlooking possible actions in the latter two categories. But in fact, it's these latter two categories that we feel are the most immediately actionable for districts and states, while diversity, the first category, is the one area that we should expect will only gradually change over time as we build out that pipeline and increase the flow of individuals into the profession. So by identifying these common policy missteps, we hope that the book can help stakeholders committed to diversity take advantage of the current policy opportunity in the most efficient ways possible. And finally, to conclude, we argue diversity is not only important for its ability to mitigate longstanding achievement gaps, but also because it's key to promoting equity throughout the public school system. Greater diversity in our public schools is part of a healthy democracy, and we believe that more diverse school systems will be different school systems, more attuned to the public stakeholders they serve. And finally, we also believe that increasing teacher diversity can lead to a cascading series of equity-enhancing improvements across many dimensions of public schools, including finance, student inclusion, integration, and many others. And now I will turn the presentation over to Patty.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you also to Seth and Constance for writing a comprehensive text detailing the importance of diversifying the teacher workforce, and most importantly, providing concrete actions that can be undertaken by a variety of stakeholders in order to do so. I want to begin a little bit by sharing my own educational journey as a Latina immigrant English learner. When I arrived in school, the expectations were learn English and assimilate with all due haste. And it was a lesson that as a young child was very clear to me and which I mastered. It wasn't until I was in high school that I became aware of the stark differences in how students were treated based on who they were and what they looked like. And with all the self-righteousness and indignation that I think only adolescents can embody and get away with, I determined that the real world was different. And I dropped out of school and began working. And lo and behold, I realized that the real world was not different. I received my GED, finished my undergraduate degree on the 20-year plan, and went into education as a career changer later in my life. And I remember sitting in my car at the end of my first day in my field experience, reflecting on how little things had changed since I was that age. It wasn't until I was in my doctoral studies, and again, I entered education later in my life, that I was exposed to a Hispanic, a Latina educator. And I credit that experience with an awakening of and a reconnection to my cultural and ethnic identity, as well as a realization of an immense sense of loss. Those experiences are what fueled my passion in the work that BranchEd does, which so aligns with this book. BranchEd is the first and only nonprofit organization that focuses specifically on working with minority-serving institutions' educator preparation programs. So our goal is really about diversifying the teaching profession and intentionally championing educational equity for all students. In case any in our audience don't know, minority-serving institutions, or MSIs, are federal designations that are given to colleges and universities that serve a significant percentage of undergraduates in a given racial category or ethnic category. There are 285 MSIs, and they provide traditional or alternative route educator preparation programs, and they prepare approximately 48% of our nation's teachers of color. They have the longest and most significant track record of preparing diverse educators who are uniquely equipped for long-term success in the teaching profession. We too are clear in our stance that diversity is quality, meaning that high-quality educator preparation embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion as fundamental, not tangential, to the preparation of all educators. Diversity is an asset and lever to enhance learning and academic achievement of all students, but more than that, there is an affective component to having exposure to a teacher who shares your racial and/or ethnic background. The topic of this book is what BranchEd is all about. As I read the book, there were several aspects I found particularly salient. There is strong evidence as to the importance of exposing teachers to diverse educators. All students benefit from exposure to diverse individuals, perspectives, ways of knowing and doing. And this isn't just true for PK-12, it's also true for post-secondary and in business. That said, I think it's important to point out that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted communities of color and the enrollment of students of color, particularly from low-income schools, which serve a large number of students of color. This will ultimately further impact enrollment into teacher preparation programs. I truly appreciate the authors providing a historical accounting of the factors that undermine efforts to diversify the teacher workforce and lays bare how policies and practices have and continue to impede the diversification of the teacher workforce. What I most appreciate in the book is the multifaceted approach detailed by the authors to address teacher diversity. First and foremost, they are clear. There are no quick fixes or silver bullets. No one action is sufficient. You can recruit them into a program, but if you've not addressed the climate, the environment, the curriculum of that program, as well as the expectations and unintended, implicit biases that occur, it's likely that they won't stay. And let's say you're successful in getting them to progress and graduate. What does certification exams that also exhibit significant bias, how does that impact their ability to continue on into the profession? And then move into employment biases that exist for teachers of color. So for me, and based on everything that I read in the book, it is a yes and, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, a then what? In closing, it is the action recommendations that I most value. Several years ago, shortly after President Obama was elected to office, I was listening to an NPR interview of a past Latin American president. I don't remember who he was, but I do remember his response when he was asked about the likelihood of world peace. And I remember he said, "Oh, it's easy. We just need to all want it." And I call that my Scooby-Doo moment, because I remember stopping and really pondering his response for quite some time. And I finally realized that he was so on point. Let us just reflect on this past year. Look at what has been able to be accomplished when schools, colleges, and universities had to pivot to online instruction. I was still at the university at that point in time. And in a matter of 3 days, we transitioned 5,000 course sections into fully online. Even those faculty who swore they would never teach online embraced the reality and work together in order to make sure that students were served. Look at how quickly the medical community has coalesced to develop a vaccine. We all wanted it. We had the ganas, the desire to do what needed to be done. So my question to us today regarding diversification of the teacher workforce is, how bad do we want it? Because the time is past due. Thank you so much.
Well, thank all of you. That was tremendous. And again, I'm going to encourage everyone to go out and purchase the book. And as well as we want to hear from you. We want to get your questions. You can hashtag teacher diversity on social media. You can submit questions by tagging the Brown Center using the Twitter handle at Brookings Ed, Brookings Ed. Or by sending an email to events@brookings.edu. And like I said, we'll be pulling these questions throughout the panel discussion. But I'm going to ask a few questions of my illustrious panelists. And this is great. And I'm first going to direct it to Seth, because I just really want you to drill down on the race match effects that you saw. But break that down a little bit. But then, as was mentioned, teacher diversity is good for all students. What did you find, not only when you match the race of the teacher and the student, but what about its impact on all students?
Yeah, great question. I think that the effect of teachers of color on white students is somewhat overlooked. And I'll start with that, actually. There's no effect on academic outcomes, positive or negative. And the reason is that white students are going to have some white teachers. They're going to have many white teachers over the course of their career. However, where I think that the benefit is in terms of their racial and social attitudes. It changes their perspective. It changes their life outlook by seeing that, it's not only people from my neighborhood, or not only people like me that can be professionals, that can be teachers. And I think that creates a newfound respect and a more open view of society that's very much for the better. There's studies from the military where there's random assignments to barracks and things like that. And white cadets who are randomly assigned to a mentor of color or a bunkmate of color are much more likely to room with a colleague of color in the future, and their stated racial and social attitudes change as well, to be more open-minded. There's also evidence that it changes their voting habits and things like that. So generally, I think that there's this sort of somewhat hard to identify, but very real effect on white students' racial and social attitudes. In terms of how students of color benefit, well, there the evidence is very, very clear. And it goes back 20 or 30 years, and some of it's qualitative and some of it's more quantitative. But we've known for a long time that students of color tend to have higher test scores in the years that they have a teacher of color. And more recently, that evidence has been really honed in on using experimental evidence. One of the papers that Constance and I worked on uses experimental data from the Tennessee Star class size experiment, where students and teachers were randomly assigned to classrooms. And using that data, Tom D at Stanford shows that a Black student who's randomly assigned to a classroom taught by a Black teacher does significantly better on their end of year math and reading tests than their Black peers in the same school, in the same grade, from the same neighborhood, who didn't get assigned to a Black teacher. Now, what does that mean for the long run? Well, the only reason we care about test scores is we think that they predict the long run outcomes we care about, like employment, college going, and so on. And so for that reason, Constance and I and some others in our research team looked at that same experimental data from the Tennessee Star class size experiment, and then looked 20, 30 years down the line. Did that Black student who randomly was assigned to a Black classroom teacher in kindergarten or first grade, were they more likely to graduate high school? Were they more likely to enroll in college? And the answer is unambiguously yes. They're 5 to 10% more likely to enroll in college and graduate from high school. And it's not just Tennessee, it's not just this class size experiment data set. This long run result, we replicated using statewide data from North Carolina. Scott DeLomer, a recent PhD graduate of UT Austin, replicates this result for Black and Hispanic and Asian students in Texas, using administrative data for the entire state of Texas. So it's not, the evidence is very robust from many different contexts, many different settings, that these effects are very real on a host of outcomes, and most importantly, on the outcomes we care most about, that long run educational attainment.
You know, Michael, you talk a lot about labor economics. You're a labor economist. Now, what's fascinating to me is that's also not dealt with a lot is the impact of diverse teachers on other teachers. Can you just, play this out? Because clearly there has to be an impact when you have a more diverse workforce on the entire school. Do you see anything related to the achievement you're seeing with students to this overall better conditions among teachers?
That's a really great question, Andre. Thank you for asking. So we do know that teachers impact each other. So there's a number of studies that look at teacher effects and how they learn from each other, how the performance of one or the arrival of a high performing teacher, for example, can impact the performance of their peers. And that is a real improvement. Now, one of the interesting things, I don't know specifically whether there's been any evidence that look at teachers of color and whether the arrival of a teacher of color impacts peers in a different way. However, I will say this, is that we do have evidence that when you have large numbers when you have more teachers of color or more representative, a more representative educator workforce. So when I say educators, I mean both principals and teachers, that we do tend to have decisions that tend to be made more in the interests of a more inclusive interests, I guess you could say. So inclusive of the interests of both white students and any students of color who are also being served in that school. Also, teachers of color tend to move up into management positions. go up the career ladder slightly more likely than at least white female teachers do. And so I think there are good reasons to feel that that when we have teachers of color, that they do positively impact the school environment, and they do help others. They do help others learn. And also, I think one of the, though I don't feel like we have quantitative evidence, but qualitative evidence that as you do have a diverse group of people that you're working with, that also, as Seth described, it also helps to shape opinions. It helps shape views of other educators. And as I mentioned, as I described in the opening presentation, part of what we want to do with increasing teacher diversity is help to shape white teachers' perspectives and help to change some of those unconscious biases.
No, Constance, you know, it goes without saying, brown skin of whatever you doesn't magically give you teaching gifts. But what about the lived experience provide or shifts your expectations for students? What is that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think one of the nice things about the book that we can't do with some of the empirical articles is we can actually talk about some of the mechanisms, right? We see these match effects, but we want to know why. And so one of the things that we do is we draw on this, very long-standing body of work from Black education researchers who talk about things like culturally responsive pedagogy, and being able to relate to students. And so it's not necessarily the match, right? It is actual activities and praxis that is able to sort of translate, a shared common cultural understanding into academic outcomes for students. And so, we talk about Gloria Ladson-Billings and her culturally relevant pedagogy, and just the ways in which teachers of color are able to relate to students of color. And some of this might be also operating through socioeconomic status. And so, it's not necessarily the match per se, right? It's the actions and activities that these teachers are more likely to engage in that lead to these particular outcomes.
I'm going to ask Patty this question as someone who was a former dean and ran a school of ed. Most schools of ed, you see right away that they are mostly white women in them. What do colleges of education, schools of education need to do in order to improve that aspect of the pipeline?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, they need to partner with their districts and with their schools. We cannot prepare teachers and we cannot attract teachers if we're not working very closely with school districts. We need to expose kids early on to this idea of teaching as an excellent profession, right? A wonderful career to embark on. When I think about the way engineer and computer science and all of those kinds of, career opportunities, how they attract and how they go into the schools and really entice the kids into the profession. I think that's something that we need to start doing as educators. So we need to partner with schools. We need to get kids exposed to teaching early. We need to give them opportunities in order to be able to see what a great career it really is. I think we also, I think there's something to be said for teacher education programs to really think innovatively and really kind of reconceptualize and reconfigure the manner in which they prepare teachers. A lot of it is often, very similar across many years. And I think we're at a point right now, and I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity to do that, to really think about what does innovative teacher preparation look like. I think that partnership is crucial, because if we do, even if we were to do everything right in a teacher preparation program, if we haven't addressed the space in which they're going to enter once they leave us, we've only half done the job, right? And so I really think that partnership is really essential.
Seth, what's interesting, I want you to walk us through, because when you read the book, the one thing you become much clearer about is how a student can have a horrible school experience and not want to become a teacher. you know, and also, and I want Constance and Patty to pick up on this after Seth responds. Like we treat teaching sort of separate from the overall labor market. And so when folks are going into education, many students are making a economic decision to not go into teaching because, you know, they won't pay off their student loans. And so, but first, Seth, can you connect some dots for us to, you know, because, you know, when you don't have teacher diversity, you're probably less likely to want to become a teacher in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And there's a fundamental sort of chicken and egg problem. I talked a lot about our study that shows the long-run effects of same-race teachers on college enrollment, and that right there, you know, a college degree is a gatekeeper to becoming a teacher for the most part in nowadays. Another study of mine shows that having a parent who is a teacher also predicts whether you enter teaching. Teaching is very much transmitted within families. Well, once again, if most of the teachers are white, that means most of the children of teachers are white. And that's another sort of similar channel that sort of perpetuates this disproportionately white teaching force. But you're right. The effect on college enrollment very much, I don't think this has been formally studied yet, but I'm sure it will be soon. I would bet dollars to donuts that there is a long run effect of having a same race teacher on entering the teacher workforce. And again, the reason is for the channels and the mechanisms that we've talked about, that Constance just talked about. Part of it is, you know, seeing someone who looks like you working as a teacher, right? That changes your mindset about, oh, maybe I could do this, maybe I should do this, maybe maybe it's a nice job. Same for the engagement channel. If part of the reason we see these race match effects is that it builds relationships and builds kids' engagement with school and their belief in their abilities, their belief in their ability to complete a degree, well, that's going to carry over to choosing that line of work and succeeding in that line of work, right? Getting the teaching credential, going to major in a teacher program, and so on.
I want for Constance and Patty to pick up on that, because you guys are developing teachers, and you know, when they get to you, what are they saying? You know, how do those experiences in high school, elementary, middle, high, impact your ability to recruit a teacher workforce?
Yeah, so some of the things you've already mentioned, right? So this question of debt. I have a colleague, Dominique Baker, who's at Southern Methodist University, where we're actually trying to look at debt burdens of students of color and their likelihood of becoming a teacher. And basically we find that sort of, you know, students of color need loans to access college, but once it gets past a tipping point, they don't want to become teachers because you have to have the ability to pay your bills back, right? It's a pretty rational decision. When it comes to the schools of education, though, I mean, I want to underscore some of the things that Patty talked about. There's a data visualization I did when I was at the Urban Institute where we show that, you know, the minority serving institutions are producing more than their fair share of students of color. And so what you find is that for a lot of the sort of predominantly white universities, the students of color are not necessarily attracted to the curriculum that's in the traditional education prep programs, because they are interested in social justice and they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. And so I think there's lots of complex reasons about why people become teachers. And I think for all students, and then a lot of that stuff is felt more acutely by students of color. So we have to start addressing that by thinking about how we're training teachers. Does it make sense to sort of continue with the traditional undergrad prep model? So for example, at UNC, we don't have a large, we don't really train undergraduate teachers anymore. There's a program where you get a STEM undergraduate degree, and then you stay for a year of Master's of Arts in teaching. And so thinking about models like that are a little bit more adaptable to today's sort of students, I think there's lots of barriers that sort of work against getting students of color into the traditional education programs, but perhaps we need to rethink how we're doing all that. And I think that's a lot of the exciting work that Patty and the folks at Branch Ed are doing.
So I think another point is, this idea of the kinds of experiences that kids have had in school themselves, right? And so it's like Seth spoke about earlier, chicken or the egg kind of situation. If you've had a bad experience in school, chances are that you're not necessarily, you're either going to be passionate about wanting to go in there and change it, which is, I think, the fewer people fall into that stance, or you're over it. You don't want to have anything else to do with it. And so that creates some significant issues. So we've got to be thinking about what do we need to do from an environmental, cultural kind of perspective within the schools so that students have, kind of a different experience. I think the other thing is kids either have an experience with a teacher who's not good, and they think, oh my God, I'm not putting, no way I want to do this. Or they have an amazing teacher who makes it look so easy that it makes them think anybody can do it, right? So it's almost like one extreme or the other. But I do think part of what we need to start thinking about is how do we, especially with regard to diversity, how do we think about financial support, right? When we think about teaching, where they have to do an internship, an unpaid internship, and that's why these residency models are so fantastic, right? But that's a real issue. We've had some students who make it all the way through, and then when they get to that point, it's like I can't do it. And the cost of these certification exams are pretty exorbitant, and they don't have to take just one, right? They have to take multiple exams. So I think, again, there's just so many factors that we need to attend to that could make significant differences if we came at it from all of those different points.
Michael, at the Brookings Institution, one of the preeminent policy think tanks in the United States, we're constantly looking for how the federal policy can impact social problems. We have a rescue plan on the table that's supposed to deliver billions of dollars to states and districts. How can any of this be used to help transform the profession? We're reading all over the country, where initially people wanted that money to stave off layoffs, but you're also just seeing waves of retirements all over the place. And this money might be used to change the way we train and recruit teachers. Based upon your looking at rescue plan and other federal relief efforts, what do you think is promising in terms of changing the way we train teachers to help address these diversity needs?
Well, what we should be doing is we can start providing opportunities for new ways of exposing students to a number of different types of teachers of color, or even just at some kind of paraprofessionals of color even. So my understanding is that Seth has a piece coming out that's talking about being creative on summer school, on after school programs. So these things are part of ways that schools and districts are trying to be creative about recouping the losses from COVID and the pandemic. But many of these types of programs, some of them don't necessarily need a racially diverse teacher workforce to staff them. And we can use paraprofessionals to staff after school programs. We can use other people in the community to help with summer schools. And these could provide opportunities to provide some of those diversity exposures that we were describing. Also, in terms of layoffs, we've seen a number of states that have talked about prioritizing diversity and layoffs. I think there is some good intent there, though I think there's also potentially some legal pitfalls or challenges that are lurking just around the corner in this approach. However, I feel that if we were to lean on the teacher diversity is teacher quality mantra that we talked about, and if we operationalize teacher race as one element of a teacher's quality and then prioritize quality in layoffs, I think we'd be much better off in approaching that scenario, in approaching layoffs in that way, because we'd preserve quality, preserve diversity that way.
Seth, you want to jump in on that question?
Yeah, just real quickly, Mike mentioned that I'm working on this piece with the National Center that hopefully should be out in the next week or so. And it hits and overlaps with a few parts of the book, so it's very timely. You know, how should we spend those billions of dollars in the recovery plan? Well, one of the best evidence-based learning recovery programs is a tutoring program, or high dosage tutoring. Maybe that happens in the summer, maybe it happens during school or after school. That doesn't matter so much. What we argue, though, is that a lot of schools are going to use those funds and should use those funds for high dosage tutoring type of interventions. And we argue that this is an amazing opportunity to be very strategic in who gets hired as tutors and who gets assigned as tutors and where they get assigned. And so if we can bring in a more diverse set of tutors, not only is that going to benefit the immediate impact of these learning recovery programs for the same reasons that same race teachers matter, but also a nice turn of phrase in the book that we talk about is lowering the career ladder, making it easier to enter teaching. And so we view this as a win-win situation where not only are those tutors that get hired as part of the Recovery Act going to be effective right now, but maybe we can get some of them to enter into the teacher training pipeline and use this as a recruiting tool and as a way that potential teachers of color can get some experience in schools, can get some access to schools, and potentially get paid while they learn about and move along their path to becoming a teacher.
You know, I'm going to ask one, because so many of the questions that have come in, I just want to acknowledge so many people. You have Audrey Alteri, Janelle Ars, Mignon Blake, Adian Garcia, Tiffany McDowell, and a lot of them are generally around the same question. So I'm going to ask one, the last question before we do a round of closing statements. One from Tiffany McDowell. Could the presenters expand on the policy recommendation about engineering more opportunities for exposures to teachers and individuals of color? What are example policies? And again, we got a number of questions about models that you're seeing out there. Can any one of you jump on any models or things that you're seeing? I'm sure there's good things that the good UNC School of Education are doing, or American U, but anything you're seeing that can be lifted up as a model.
Yeah, I'll just throw out a real quick one since we're low on time. Even a 15-minute guest lecture from an expert or a professional doesn't have to be a teacher, right? It can be a professional or community member. And schools have assemblies all the time, right? Whether it's an artist coming to give a performance or a professional coming to give a career day talk. And let's just, and some schools are doing this well, but let's just be real strategic and real thoughtful about who gets invited to those venues. And that same person can visit, many classrooms, or they can visit, they can, in a school-wide event, they can talk to everybody. So that's one quick thing and one idea of what we mean by, creating exposures with the teaching staff we have. Similarly, teachers can give guest lectures in their colleagues' classrooms, right? And that's another way to make the most of the teaching force that we currently have.
Well, that's great. I'm going to encourage everyone to get the book, Teacher Diversity and Student Success, off of Harvard University Press. Again, you can get a 20% discount by going to the Harvard Education Press website and using the discount code TDSS21. That's T as in Tom, D as in David, S is in Sam, S is in Sam 21. And so I'm going to ask our panelists, esteemed panelists, to just go around and say a few closing thoughts. And we'll start off with Patty. So Patty.
Yes, thank you so much. So again, first of all, I want to thank the authors for the book. I really feel it's timely. I appreciate the information that's included in it. And I truly appreciate the fact that you moved to action. We sometimes have a tendency to do a lot of talking, and you ended the book on a here's what we need to be doing. So I appreciate that, and I encourage everyone to pick up the book and read it. They'll learn a lot.
Constance?
Yeah, I just think, as we're moving forward and thinking about what next school year looks like, this is an opportunity to be really creative. There's an example of in Rhode Island where they're expanding the licenses to paraprofessionals right now. So I think we can do some of these things in real time, and then we'll have some data to see, what works and what we can change. So I think we have a tremendous opportunity to make some progress on this right now.
Seth?
Yeah, I was really happy that we were able to write the closing chapters of the book the way we did, being bold and creative in making our policy recommendations. And it's not the usual academic writing of hemming and hawing and hedging, where I think we make some bold, concrete proposals that I hope people take seriously. And I think on the diversity front, something we didn't talk so much about today, which is important, I think, is the grow your own and teacher residency programs. I think those are really going to be key to increasing the diversity in the long run.
And Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. I just wanted to say thank you for helping us to moderate and have everyone participate with us. And sort of to bring it back full circle, Andre talked about this cataclysm, this catastrophe that happened in New Orleans that wiped out teacher diversity there. I'm hoping that the current catastrophe that we're in with the pandemic, that this is something that instead of taking from the New Orleans model and we take a few steps back on diversity, that we actually do something to really be proactive about moving forward and being strategic about how we promote diversity in our schools. And not just diversity, but also with, tutoring, with trying to equalize our investments in various schools across the country, even rural schools, all the schools that are sort of often are missed out and are not part of the policy conversations. We need to really help. There's many people that need to be helped right now. And I hope that this is an opportunity and a call to action that we come back with an even better system.
And thank you very much. And I'm Andre Perry, closing out. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists, the Brown Center, and of course, Brookings, the Brookings Institution for putting this on. Again, it's a great read. I think the last chapter's titled Taking Action. And it really is a book that sets us up to take action. And I can't say during these perilous times, that's what we need to do. And so I want to thank you for allowing me to ask a few questions and engage you. And I look forward to hearing your reviews online using the hashtag teacher diversity. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.